Okay, so up next we have our plenary panel on disruptive technologies that'll be moderated by Dave Lebeau. Dave is the executive director in EY Advisory's supply chain and operations practice. So I'd like to welcome Dave and his panelists to come on up.
For the introduction. Welcome to the Disruptive Technology and Supply Chain panel, also known as the panel after lunch on Friday. So we're going to try to keep it moving and light, and I am really amazed that all of you are still here, so thank you very much for staying. All of us have thought about or heard about disruptive technologies. We all know the buzzwords. Hopefully we're thinking about it and doing it as well, looking for applications. Additive manufacturing or 3D, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, machine learning, even quantum. Autonomous vehicles, cars, trucks, and drones. We're going to talk about a lot of these things today with a fantastic panel. The challenge is we've had lots of great presentations today, or the past 2 days, so we're going to try to avoid duplicating things. So we won't be talking about blockchain. I think we got enough of a deep dive on that. We will, however, touch on a few other things of importance to this group, like logistics and the impact of disruptive technologies on the people in our supply chains. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce, actually, one thing I want to mention, sorry. Note about the format. There will be no PowerPoints. Actually, usually that gets applause. We are going to break for questions in the middle to keep you awake, so please get ready, get prepared. And we're going to try to keep it moving. So we've got great panelists, and I want to let each of them talk several times, so we're going to try to keep it rolling along. And all of us have talked about that, so I'm sure we're in alignment. Okay, let's go to the digital content. Let me introduce our panelists. Sanne Manders joined Flexport in 2014, soon after the company's start. As COO, he is responsible for operations, procurement, and carrier relations across all modes of transportation. For Flexport, he was at BCG, the global management consultancy, leading customer relations in logistics and supply chain in that practice. John Daly, on the other end, is president of Algomus, a machine learning and AI supply chain firm supporting manufacturing, distribution, and retail solutions. Prior to Algomus, John led Sony Pictures Worldwide global supply chain for the home entertainment business, and I discovered that we all have his DVDs in our homes. You made billions and billions of DVDs. So if you want to talk about volume stuff, I think John's a good guy to talk to. In the middle, Katy McShane is the Director of Customer Success at Lanetix, where she leads new customer implementations as well as account management strategy. Lanetix cloud-based solutions enables transportation and logistics companies to manage their customer life cycles, including CRM bid responses, customer onboarding, and retention. Prior to that, Katy worked in sales and operations at Cargomatic, which some of you may know, the online LTL and truckload platform. Second to last is Cyrus, Hadavi, founder and CEO of Adexa, the leading supply chain planning technology company headquartered here in LA. Prior to Adexa, he was one of the original members of I2 and a research scientist at Siemens Research Labs, where he was among the pioneers of AI applications to planning problems. And finally, Manju Devadas is a founder and the CEO of Pluto 7, one of the top 5 Google partners for machine learning and AI, with a focus on supply chain business transformation. Manju is an industry advisor for ML and AI at the Google CTO office as well, and has 17 years of predictive analytics experience, so a pioneer in that area. So welcome to the panel. Thank you. Please a round of applause for the panel, if you don't mind. Okay, let's jump into our topics. This is a question for all the panelists. One of the most disruptive technologies today is machine learning, and generally AI. How is machine learning having an impact on supply chain? Is it just automating the things we already do, or is it fundamentally different? Let's start with you.
Right, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I think there's a big difference between automation and machine learning, and even AI. And it is basically how much data do you need, right? If it's automation, it's if-then statements, right? You need a couple of points of information, and you can let the machine do the work. In machine learning, you need actually much more data, because the machine is actually making some kind of a decision within the guardrails that you have specified. For AI, you let actually the machine make the decision, or actually come up with the decision algorithm themselves. Well, in this whole scope, you need little data, more data, and tons of data. And it depends on the supply chain application, but we are an international freight forwarding and customs brokerage. For AI, it's a bit early, I would say. There is not that much data, because the fundamental issue in this industry is that it's a human-to-human relay race. A lot of the data is not structured. For machine learning, there are definitely a lot of applications. We use it in pricing, predictive analytics. AI for us is too early. Automation is the bread and butter of what we do.
Thank you. Just to add to what my co-panelist just highlighted, being one of the top partners of Google, we have the privilege of working with some of the most complex supply chain problems in the world. If there's somebody who wants to compete with Amazon or the likes of that scale, and the problem inherently is complex both by the volume of data or the nature of decision making in the supply chain, we get exposure to such problem statements. Now, when we look at these disruptive technology, when you look at it in isolation, it looks like, okay, this is something new and fancy, but if you actually double click it, Google has been using some of these technologies for human decision making, whether it's search or contextual search and so on, for the last 15 years. When you apply the same thing for improving the taste of beer, now that looks pretty radical, right? I mean, last week I was on stage talking about how we improve the taste of Budweiser beer. Now, if you think about that for a second, it's about production quality, replacing the filter on at the right time. Now we are talking about preventive maintenance, which means saving costs. Now there are more examples I'll quote as we go through this, but the point I'm trying to make here is, it's real, it's here, it's really up to our imagination to apply to our business to impact the KPIs.
Thank you, Manju. Katy?
Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. So I think what we're seeing at Lanetix is that a lot of our customers are logistics service providers, so DHL Supply Chain, Neovia Logistics, various folks, and they're all interested in automating their business processes, similar to Flexport. And so one of the use cases that we're seeing a lot of folks using our technology for is qualifying out business and opportunities that may or may not be a great fit for your business. And so using some kind of stage gate or a workflow scoring model to do that can be really useful as a way of evaluating what is good business that we should be going after, saves a lot of time and a lot of expensive meetings. So we're seeing a lot of automation and tools around that use case in particular.
One of the points that you mentioned, whether AI is automation or not, from our perspective, from planning supply chains, automation is a repetitive process and the outcome is predictable. With AI, we don't know what we don't know. So we use AI and machine learning technology in basically three different ways. One is when we build the models of your supply chain in order to plan for the future, these models, they change over time. The delivery performance changes in different seasons. Suppliers may...
This is a real-time update.
I hope you heard what I said earlier.
It was brilliant.
So as the model of the supply chain changes, there are a lot of things that we are not aware of. We don't know if the assumption of a certain resource working 80% of the time is probably now working 70% of the time. So the idea is to kind of pick up on these patterns and then correct the model of the supply chain on an ongoing basis. Once we do that, obviously we get much better results. But even more interesting is to look into the future, because every time you plan into the future, you come across problems. Certain products are causing certain lateness issues. And again, looking at these underlying patterns, you can prevent the risk of, the late deliveries in winter in Ohio, whatever the case might be. And then lastly, which is very interesting for us, is AI and machine learning. You can use the technology to come up or create new algorithms. One idea is in demand planning, where you use different forecasting techniques, and combination of these forecasting techniques and looking back, whether I should look back 20 periods or 40 periods, all of a sudden you can mutate these policies and then come up with some incredibly good forecasting techniques based on the product or based on the regions that you're trying to forecast.
Great, thank you. John?
Good afternoon. I'll follow up with what Cyrus had to say. I find right now an incredibly interesting period of time where machine learning and data that we can look at is helping us at that, I'll call it the last 20 feet, 50 feet at retail, especially with consumer products. Right, that age-old question about what do we ship, when do we ship it, what's in store, what's on shelf, is now something we can really look at it. And I find some very interesting case studies on this that we're working with, where you're really able today to start looking at stores based on how they behave, right? And just like all of us, the stores behave very differently. The products in those stores behave very differently. So when you start thinking about using the data to start clustering stores in terms of how they behave, or you start looking at balanced scorecards for stores, right? What's in stock? What have the sales been? What are the returns? What's the profitability of that store? How do you link that data up to help instruct merchandisers in terms of going into the store? And what we're hearing a lot of is, hey, we have the data, but we need to make it actionable. How can you drive information or actions to store personnel, to the suppliers, into the supply chain? How do you match up data that merchandisers have with photographs of in-stock positions in stores back to the data you have? So it's incredibly powerful. If you think about, we heard some statistics yesterday about, I think the number was like $690 billion of product that is not sold because of out-of-stock situations. So when you start thinking about the retail space today, and just the economics of having the right product in the right store, not having excess product in the store, right? Not being out of stock in the store, and knowing that the stores are behaving differently, machine learning can today start letting us look into thousands and thousands of retail locations, thousands and thousands of SKUs, and start identifying where those opportunities are. And our customers are seeing that that's driving significant ROI to the bottom line as they make 1%, 2%, 3% changes on excess inventory, returns, in-stock rates, et cetera. So a really exciting time right now for machine learning and what it's bringing along. Great,
thank you very much. We're kind of skimming the surface of machine learning and AI. So let's do something different. Let's take some questions from the audience about that topic in particular. Who would like to ask a few questions? We've got plenty of time. I can't believe there are no questions. Are you surprised by being allowed to ask questions in the middle of the panel? I did mention we would do that. Anyone? Oh, someone in the back. Thank you.
Well, the title is Disruptive. How are these technologies disruptive?
How are they disruptive in the supply chain?
Right.
Okay, who would like to take that on, please?
So, disruption happens when it beats our belief. I'll give you a real-world example. About 9 months back, we went into a semiconductor company with the C-level executives, one of the big semiconductor companies. They make chips on most of your phones. And we said, we're going to beat your forecast by 20%, or 15% at least. They were like, there's no way. We have been running the business for 30 years, right? There's no way you're going to come in with some cool algorithm and beat us. We beat us 8 out of the 10 times. Or in the beer example I was giving, the person who tasted the beer for 30 years said, there's no way you're going to come and write an algorithm to predict the accuracy of my beer taste and quality of the beer. We beat that. And they acknowledge that we beat that, right? So when we disrupt the human belief of what the norm is, what the KPI is, that's when we are revisiting how we should run our business. 20 years back, if we told, or 25 years back, that internet is going to disrupt your world, just the fact that two computers talking is going to change every department in a company, I would say most of us probably would have found it hard to believe. And if you say the same thing about AI today, it's still going to be hard to believe, but nobody challenges internet today, and we take it for granted. So that's disruption.
Excellent. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I really like your question, and I'm talking, my scope of the supply chain is different than the scope of yours, so if I say something negative, then it's about my scope of the supply chain. But I like your question because disruption suggests what you say, that it's beyond the belief. If you're looking at, let's say, freight forwarding and customs brokerage, that is also an industry where you could say it's still living in the pre-Netscape. So if you call that disruption, to go from pre-Netscape to post-Netscape, structuring data, that's not disruption, that is evolution that has to catch up, honestly, or maybe accelerated evolution. We first have to build the circuit board, the data infrastructure, to allow us to build disruptive technologies on. So I fully agree with you that let's first build the data infrastructure and then disrupt, instead of talking about disruption all the time.
Great. Anyone else?
For me, the conventional approach, which includes operations research and optimization, it's a very deterministic process that we know what to expect. The system, works on data and comes back with an answer. With the kind of techniques we're talking about, number one, we are in a position to come up with answers which are unpredictable. It may be better or it may be worse. And then we also have the opportunity to create new approaches and algorithms by mutation of existing algorithms. In other words, we are kind of creating new ways of looking at data as opposed to known and conventional ways of doing it.
Great, thank you. Another question?
My question is, hello. This is much more amplified. Yeah. So I guess, I don't know how much this relates to disruptive technology, but just technology in general, I think, has consumed us in such a way for, I'm a youngster, I'm one of the millennials, I'm 25, I'm starting to get into global supply chain, pursuing a master's in global medicine. So my question is, how do we change the way a lot of the new generation is being so consumed by social media, and they have so much potential. We have geniuses in the world, but these people are being distracted 6-7 hours a day, playing Fortnite, HBO, Netflix, chill, the usual. I'm just I'm a huge mental health advocate, and I want to help people change their perception. And you guys are leaders in what you're doing right now. So for me, this is just a genuine question of what can I do as maybe a potential leader in the future?
Just a second while I Google the answer for you. Just kidding.
Thank you. Shots fired.
Are you solving a personal problem or?
This is a personal vendetta I have.
So this is a huge problem. How many of you are parents of 25 or roughly
under
age people? Yeah, under 25. Yeah, so a number of us have experience with exactly what you're talking about. Any points of view on this?
It's interesting that you mentioned the trend. We are really going along with the trends. I mean, the way young people nowadays, they work, they just text back and forth and expect real-time answers. And this generation, when they go and work with systems and supply chain, they cannot wait for even 10 minutes to get a response. And the way they work with the system, the interaction that goes with the system, I mean, this is essentially driving the direction that we are going to make sure that we can respond to them in real time. in terms of what they want, what they need, and so on and so on, and then be able to communicate. Collaboration has become just as important as optimization. So, you can't really optimize without knowing how the users are actually using the system and collaborating with each other.
Yeah, just to echo that, we're seeing a similar trend where you have more global teams that need to work together in real time, and so that kind of collaboration has to happen on the global scale as well. Across time zones, and the information needs to be accessible to everyone on mobile devices, desktops, what have you. So I think we're seeing increasingly numbers of people who are on the road or who need to sell across regions need to use a product.
I would add as well that a lot of the young people we're working with today find it very interesting when they can get in on cross-functional teams that take on a project of, using data to drive results, whether that's sustainability, whether that's to drive profitability, whether that's to reduce inventory. And because the data tools today are so visual, interactive, there's a certain lean-in that we find the young professionals are doing to really get involved with this and see the results quickly, right? Which I find very, very interesting. And they'll think about it in ways that are very different from my upbringing, which was traditional supply chain. So I think if you can take the format of, your business KPIs, what your performance you have to go after, and you pull in this data and let people really look at the data in ways that are innovative and new, we find a really good middle ground where people find that to be something they're interested in doing.
That's great. Sanne.
Yeah, so you can say that young people waste their time, but they're also extremely efficient, right? If you stand next to people on their iPhone in the train, they use multiple apps at the same time, and they do a lot of work at the same time in parallel. So what we do is we just design our apps in the same way, and but we get the feedback from our surveys that our apps look like Facebook for freight. If people like to use it, they will use it.
That's amazing. Can I also, okay, keep going. So with that, no, I appreciate the input, but also what I tend to see is that my friend has an MBA, graduated from here, and he had told me that 85% of our nation does not have a 4-year accredited degree. 85%. We're living in a bubble right now of young professionals right now where we're standing. And so we're only optimizing 15% of our country to be the leaders of today or of tomorrow. That, for me, is so disheartening to see. And so what I'm trying to say is, how do we educate people through technology in a way to do this global, in a way that people understand in common language to influence. You see what I'm saying, if that makes sense?
Maybe I can take a shot at that. So I have a different perspective. So when I started out at Procter & Gamble many, many years ago, I hate to tell you how, probably before you were born, most of the people didn't have a college degree. Everyone in the plant was trained on technology. Everyone was trained to be a leader. You don't have to have a college degree to be productive in society. I think you have to have the right skills. So maybe we can change the question to be, how do we get people to have the right skills so they can be contributing members of society as the technology continues to evolve? And my guess is that if you're good at apps on the iPhone, you've got a head start.
True. Okay.
So, all right, so excellent questions. Thank you. Please.
Thank you.
My question is for Sanne. This is Stephanie Hughes with Mediterranean Shipping Company. You've experienced 2 cyber attacks of late with Maersk Line and Costco. How did you handle that disruption?
Yeah, well, so our partners are experiencing cyber attacks, which basically means they're going down, right? Costco skipped sailings for a week. And I think that Maersk, I was actually in the Maersk headquarters at the moment that it happened. So you could actually walk in, even their turnstiles didn't work anymore. Yeah, that's massively disruptive. Everything that has already gated in has gated in. It's very difficult to pull it out. Everything that's on a ship, it's already on a ship. But everything that hasn't gated in, you can reroute. And have full visibility on where everything is at that moment in time. Have a strong data set that you can intervene immediately. Yeah, that's what we do. But things that are already sailing, they're already sailing, right? You can't parachute a drone in to take your container off a ship. But it's a real problem, and it also shows that those companies, and that's including us, but that's including everyone here, need to invest much more in cybersecurity.
Great, thank you. One more question.
We're moving down the road.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Hella DuPont. I'm with Vanguard Logistics. My question is also for Sanne. So you talked about right now it's in that freight forwarding space. We're not quite disruptive yet, but it's definitely a tidal wave that's coming once the infrastructure is set up. What are you envisioning as being some of these disruptive technologies, say 5 years from now?
Yeah, and it's actually also our second question. So maybe we'll go into that immediately. So the first wave of what technologies that I'm looking at are technologies that drive inputs. So just basically make sure that there's visibility on input data, right? IoT is a great example. And with IoT, you can see where everything is at any moment in time. It saves telephone calls, right? Your data quality gets enriched. ELDs, same thing, right? You can all of a sudden track all trucks. Mobile apps, that's essentially IoT. So there's a lot of data input that you can collect, and that's what we are focused on, is basically making sure that our database gets enriched more and more and more, because that sets up for the other things like machine learning and AI. If you ask me what are business disruptions enabled by technology that will happen, I think you're in one of those spaces. I think that LCL will be an industry of the future, because as we're looking right now at supply chains, and even this conference is called supply chain, it's things that are pushed through a supply chain, right? It's supplied, but essentially consumers are, consumer patterns are shifting much more quickly. So you have to get quicker to the consumer. So that means sending smaller batches. And companies want to reduce working capital. So things like LCL, smaller air shipments, all those kind of things fit in, let's say, the demand chain logic. And it serves the purpose of reducing working capital and being more agile. So that's one of the things that I think will change over time. Now, at this moment in time, a lot of customers don't trust LCL products enough yet, right? They use it for smaller batches, but not for their normal supply chain. And what we are trying to do is, for instance, changing customers that send a container every week to sending half a container, or a container every 2 weeks to half a container every week.
Great, excellent, thank you. So we'll continue on with the panel and come back for more audience questions. So I think that was your disruptive technology item, so why don't we continue? So the question is, what other disruptive technologies are you looking at, and can you give an example of how it's impacted?
So when we talk about disruptive technology, right, most of the time the thoughts go around what's the most recent one which is in the news, right? But in reality, the biggest business benefit what we see, and this is through experience, right? When we go as part of Google to solve any of these supply chain, manufacturing, retail problems, the C-level executives typically want the magical answer. What's the coolest thing or the best thing that you can do where it disrupts my business, it makes a real impact, and so on. And they want to see the machine learning model working, and we show them. But the real value is centralizing data, which is really cloud, right? Which is what some of my panelists are saying, right? But if we say that the very first day, they don't want to listen to us, because they think that, oh, that's boring. We have been doing data warehouse for 20 years, right? Or 30 years. If you take a step back, technology doesn't itself by disrupt a business. It's people, process, and technology in tandem is what disrupts a business. And like there was a previous question which was around, oh, people are spending time. Yes, there is good and bad that's going to come out of every technology. The good part, what my panelists highlighted, is now we are thinking real-time supply chain, real-time forecasting. Why not real-time? Because all my data is in the cloud, right? So it's being objective, and there are cases where machine learning and AI will truly disrupt, which has never been thought of. But in majority of the cases, centralizing the data is really what is disruptive. And the biggest centralization of data is going to happen in 2020. We're not even there yet. Most people may or may not know that the world has only consumed less than 10% of the cloud as of today. There's a huge wave coming for the next 2 years.
So I I think getting off of the cloud and onto the ground a little bit, I think I'm really excited about self-driving technology, and I think the innovations around LiDAR, and especially in the long-haul trucking space, I think that's going to be a game changer. It's where you're seeing the driver shortages. My experience at Cargomatic, we have a lot of local trucking companies and a lot of local owner-operators, but that long-haul space is where the pain point is definitely being seen a lot more. And so, looking at companies like Luminar that are really developing LiDAR, I think that's going to be a game changer in the long-haul space especially.
There are a couple of areas that I can think of. One is that, in the 80s, we talked a lot about lights out factories. But today that's a reality, and I think that took a lot of different technologies and elements to be able to nowadays essentially plan, like we do with 300 millimeter semiconductor fabrication lines. I mean, it cost about what, $10 billion, $15 billion to make these fabrication lines, and you don't want it to be down even for 1 minute because that costs tens of millions of dollars. So essentially, based on the data that we are picking up in real time, we are replanning, rescheduling, and re-optimizing the operation of the factory. The other end, when it comes, for example, to inventory optimization, you can either keep all your inventory as finished goods, which is almost impossible given all the different SKUs that you have, or you can keep everything as raw material, which then takes, weeks, if not months, to deliver. So what's the happy medium in terms of at every echelon of the supply chain between the right amount of inventory, the right mix of inventory, in order to deliver within a desired service level? With the kind of computing power that we have and the speed of memory, etc., that we have nowadays, we can deal with tens of millions of variables and immediately come up with strategies as to how much inventory to keep where in order to guarantee 98%, 99% delivery performance to end customers. And this stuff, we knew about it, but we couldn't do it even 5 years ago.
I would say a couple of things that I see, right? Blockchain, which we've talked a lot about over the last 2 days for sure. We're also looking at natural language processing, right? Which is today the ability to sit at your laptop or on your mobile phone and ask very direct business questions about what's going on, to Cyrus's point as well again, with your inventory. Where is that happening? I also see the ability for data to be used for anomaly detection, right? We had a large client the other day who was asking us about, hey John, we've got inventory in the store, we see sales occurring in the last 7 days, and then it starts to drop off. And what we think is going on is the inventory's in the store, but it's in a different location or in a place where consumers can't see it. So I think this whole world of anomaly detection, asking questions that are very deep that you can get answers on will be there. Ultimately, I see machine learning, AI being very disruptive in helping even smaller companies use all this data that's in a cloud, help deliver it to customers, but more importantly, the tools can start answering questions that we haven't even thought about asking, right? Think about that, right? Hey, I'm looking at some data and I'm seeing trends occur. Take this action or take that action. I think that's really going to innovate the supply chain as we continue to get comfortable with a lot of data in the cloud, and people become more and more comfortable using that data with suppliers, vendors, et cetera, going forward.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that is inherent in your statement, John, is we have to get comfortable being advised by machines, and we may not fully understand how they operate. So it really relates to adoption of technology. So we used to ask our staff, how many of you have a landline? How many of you have a landline at home? Okay, not that many. How many of you have cable still? How many of you know what a newspaper is? Okay. How many of you would be willing to be driven to work by an autonomous car? All right, so many more than I expected. So there's an interesting factoid about technology adoption, which is something we'll talk about soon. But it took 75 years for the telephone to reach 50 million users. It took 15 years for the DVD to reach 50 million. How long did it take Pokemon Go to reach 50 million? Anyone know? 19 hours. So we now have the ability to deploy technologies much faster than maybe we're ready for. So it'll big impact. Please.
If I can add a little bit about the Pokemon Go. When this was run on Google Cloud, it was estimated that 1 million users will hit in the first few days. And when you hit 50 million and still not worry about going down, that's disruptive technology. What's odd about how we humans consume technology and apply to our business is, like Moderator was kind of surprised that so many of you raised hand. You're ready to risk your life sitting in front of a machine and assume that the machine is going to do a better job. It does, but the fact that you're accepting that. But will you let a machine make decision on your supplier selection? Will you let a machine make decision on your forecasting quantity? Will you let a machine make decisions on your quality inspection? The chances are that because it affects your payroll and income, you are going to have a different bias towards it. But that doesn't mean machines are going to replace every job. It's just that we humans are using our brains to do even better jobs. That's the idea behind it. Which means when you go back to redesigning and rethinking your supply chain, now that you have the power, like one of the other panelists were also talking about, unlimited memory, unlimited compute capacity, ability to look at permutation, combination of information, textual and non-textual, at a speed that we as humans cannot do. If you have that power next to you, what would you use your time for? How would you change your process? Why should your process be sequential? Why can't it be parallel? And why can't it be autonomous to some extent, and then you intervene when you think the quality is, the metrics are degrading and so on? Which means it brings back to the original question. You can't change the fundamentals because you're still asking the same questions. Where is my product? How much do I need? Do I have enough supply? Is my customer happy with it? Which product is defective? Those questions have not changed 1,000 years back. They will not change hundreds of years from now. What will change is how we answer these questions.
Thank you very much. All right, let's change gears a little bit, switch gears to logistics. We've got two great panelists specifically on logistics. The rest of you probably know something about it too. So let's talk about how you're seeing these disruptive technologies making a big impact in logistics, things we haven't talked about yet. So Katy, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think, I can talk a little bit about both Cargomatic and then also Lanetix. So at Cargomatic, I think one of the big technologies that we were just talking about earlier is getting mobile devices into the hands of more people, and that doesn't require a college degree. It doesn't require you to have, intense training or anything. As long as you can pick up the phone and take a picture of a POD, you can provide that real-time information back to your customer. And so I think that that's that kind of digitization of the supply chain, I think, is really interesting and great, and can, like you said, free up people to do more productive work and also do additional work potentially. So we're also seeing more people in the logistics space focusing on relationships too. So not just digitizing all of their relationships, but actually focusing more time and prioritizing the relationships that they need to focus on. And also everyone having visibility into the last time that someone did a QBR with this carrier, or how many outreach points have we had with the shipper contact. And so just having that level of information on a global scale is something that we're working with customers on, and isn't necessarily the case across the board for especially larger legacy logistics companies. So I think just having the availability of information in everyone's hands at all levels of the supply chain, both in the office, out in the warehouse, in your trucks, I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I think there are 4 waves, and wave number 1 is a better user experience, right? It's just collecting data so that all of a sudden our customers have a better user experience. They see actually what's going on in their supply chains, and instead of keeping it afloat, they can actually look at the data and say, like, okay, my job is thinking about tomorrow instead of extinguishing fires of today. So the better user experience, that's number 1, and it's all about data collection. The next wave, for me, it's automation. We're in the middle of that, but automation needs much more data than the user experience. And that will lead to lower cost to serve, and lower cost to serve just means less humans, right? If you look at now at the top 3 forwarders in the world, they all employ around 50,000 people. There's no reason that you can't do the same type of volume with 10,000 people, because if you look at the jobs of these people, they do a lot of repetitive work. They interpret data and then give it to the next party in the chain. It's a human-to-human relay race, where a lot of these steps can be done by machines. Humans still have a lot of roles, interpretation, judgment, etc. But for a lot of things, you can take them out. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 is optimization, because then all of a sudden you have all the data, and you can start saying like, okay, let's listen to the software, what it suggests for me. So one of the things that we do is we spit out different journeys for a container. So different routes, different risk profiles, different cost profiles, and then now all of a sudden our user is empowered to choose. Where before they had to do that on the back of the envelope or in an Excel spreadsheet, and now they just get it in front of them, just like a real-time, let's say, kayak for freight that creates journeys. Right? And then a step further is kind of like, it's like autopilot, you could call it, but there are still a lot of things that need to happen for autopilot. Nice example, I don't know how you guys got here, but I got here this morning from our warehouse here in LA. If I would have been a pallet, I would not have sat here, right? Because honestly speaking, it dropped me somewhere on a curb, then I had to walk 500 feet to get to this building, then figure out that this was this building, and then ask somebody and figure out that it was actually in the basement. Well, you have to structure an insane amount of data before an autonomous pallet can do that themselves. So those are the steps that I see and the waves, and we're definitely in the user experience. The automation is happening, and then we're getting into optimization, but autonomy, that is still pretty far away. Yeah, parts of it can be autonomous, and that's long-haul trucking, for instance, but a pallet will not be autonomous coming from China into a warehouse into the US.
Great, thank you. So let's go to the audience again. Any more questions about logistics? So please, in the back. Okay, while we're getting you a microphone. Anyone else? Nearer? No, keep going.
So it has been good for discussion. So I want to come back to the first question about disruptive. This is talk about AI or blockchain being disruptive, but I guess in supply chains world, it's not that real sense it's being disruptive, right? So the question is, a lot of companies thinking, it's interesting and good to have. So the question, different angle to ask, without taking these disruptive technologies, how soon do you think the business could be disrupted, right? Is it 3 year, 5 year, 10 years, 20 years from now? So that's the first part. Do you see any some very good examples that once you take some disruptive technologies like this, a business actually, being managed very differently, in terms of ROI, much better, right? So that's first part. And second part, AI, blockchain, or IoT, how they really work together from disruptive perspective, right?
Okay, so let's take those in 2 parts. I think I would offer one thought, while you guys would like your thoughts. I think if we don't use these technologies, we will be disrupted. I don't think that it's a question of, one of these technologies is inherently disruptive. It's someone else is going to do it to you because they're actively using it. So if you're a taxi company and you didn't see Uber coming, you have a problem. And they were able to do it because they started from scratch. It's very hard to innovate in an existing operation to make massive change. I think that these technologies will immediately enable you to run your company differently if you actually apply them in certain ways. So I'll give an example. So a lot of my clients are experiencing large amounts of retirement. So the people who are very senior, they have 30 years of experience, and it takes you 10 years to get good at something like complex machine maintenance and field service. So if you're a field service engineer for extremely complex equipment, like semiconductor manufacturing equipment, it takes you a long time to get really knowledgeable about one kind of equipment. So we put together a small AI pilot for this company that basically within 3 weeks was trained on the top 100 failures and was able to correctly solve 4 out of 5. I thought that was fantastic. I was really thrilled. And I said, well, it didn't get 5 out of 5. When all of their 30-year veterans retire, they're going to wish they had a little system helping to advise their 5-year veterans on how to be as good as a 30-year veteran. So I think that that's an example where we picked a specific problem of high value to that company. There are a lot of little examples like that. So my recommendation is pick something that's of extremely high value and figure out how to have an impact on that, and you will run that part of your business differently. And it'll open up new opportunities and then keep building on that. But that's just one small example. That was a 3-week project. So any thoughts?
If you feel that autonomous vehicles are disrupted, I think what we are trying to do with supply chains is exactly the same thing. We are getting to a point where I can tell the system, optimize my supply chain. And it's going to take me through different routes. Along the way, we're going to have shortages, we're going to have breakdowns, we're going to have weather problems, we're going to have supplier issues, etc., etc. Just like a car which first decides where to go and how to get there, and you run into barriers, you run into traffic. Whatever it is, it keeps changing. And that kind of real-time response from your shock absorbers all the way up to the driver and deciding where to go, how to get there, making sure I get there on time at the lowest cost, that's really where we're trying to go. There are emotional elements, there are preferences. Some planner might give preference to this and that product manager. Even those elements can go into it. You may want to lose some revenue because you want to grab market share, and that element goes into it as well. So all of those different optimization as well as emotional elements that need to go into the plan, we are getting to a point where we can include all of that and come up with plans which are, to be honest, much, much better, more optimized, much faster than a human being is capable of.
Yeah, I would say also what I'm seeing is, the disruption with machine learning, predictive analytics, AI, the race has begun. And people are at all different levels today. But when you look at the power of what better decision making can drive for your company, if you look at the speed of getting products faster, if you look at the curation of products, right store, right day, behaviors in those stores and matching that, the race is already being run. And there's a huge amount of savings that can be delivered from that, a huge amount of doing the right thing to get the product in the right hands of the right customer at the right time. So this is a marathon, and we describe this to our customers as, if you're not in the race now and you're not training or you're not getting up to speed, you're not going to be able to run the marathon. So the game is on, it's happening. If you're in it, you've got to continue to take it from a capability to a core competency of your company. If you're not in it, you need to start thinking about getting in it, because your competitors will be. And across the supply chain, on time, lower cost, right quality, right product every day is where we're going. So you have to jump in on this. And if you're not, you'll really get knocked out by, time of service, quality of service, price of delivery, right product in the right store every day. So it's very interesting. That's why I think that, the conference we're at today is just great discussion with a lot of people talking about how do we take this on with these new technologies that are coming along.
Great, thank you.
Some of you are in healthcare supply chain, you'll relate to what I'm going to say next, right? If there's one industry that you want to watch closely how much it will get disrupted and what it will mean for you is healthcare supply chain, which means medication reaching to you. Medication reaching to you at lower cost, medication reaching to you more efficiently, and reduction in paperwork, more closely integrated with your mobile apps, to your doctors, and so on. It's also a very complex industry. There's a lot of compliance and regulations and so on. I have the privilege of working with some of the C-level executives and running workshops to discuss and brainstorm this. Now, when we talk about these independent technologies, by itself they'll have different level of maturity. Blockchain is maturity in a certain stage, machine learning at a different stage, and IoT and so on. When these problems are solved in the context of a complete company going out of business or a company really losing 30% of revenue, the conversations don't happen around how can IoT help me? The conversations are around how can I survive? Tell me whatever it takes. Or the conversation, if somebody is really trying to disrupt the market and capture, it's like, we don't care about losing 20% of our revenue, but I want to capture 100% growth by killing these 10 other competition. So think of it from those angles as well, because if we are wondering, is this technology relevant for you, either it's really not relevant for you right now, or you'll realize when it's relevant, when it's too late for you. Okay.
That's a great point. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one more point. AI is not anything new, as I'm sure most of you know. It came about, in the 70s and 80s. Became very popular. Everybody thought it's going to, knowledge workers in Japan. Yeah, it lasted for a while, but it didn't really catch on. But nowadays, we are at a point where we have the computing power, and we have the kind of memory that is needed to handle large data. That is, now we are picking up momentum to use it in many different directions.
Great. Excellent question. Did we answer all of your questions? Hopefully we did. Next one.
Hi, yes. I totally agree with structured data and needing the infrastructure in order to support machine learning and AI. I'm curious, though, I think people are comfortable with the status quo. It's easy. And so I am curious, do you have examples, or is it possible for machine learning to help structure the data? I don't even know if that is a good question to ask or not, but
you're getting some
instead of having people, I guess, is structured data an absolute prerequisite, or can you leapfrog that and utilize AI, machine learning, in order to help you structure the data?
Excellent. There's some good examples there. A great example is customs entries or customs data entry. You can do OCR, for instance. You can do manual data entry. You can actually get your data from PO management, which you can use your database of your SKUs to learn, is the data file that is now being prepared for a customs entry, is it actually, when we look at the history and we're looking at the client profile, is this done correct, and are we flagging it right now for a manual review? So you can also just use machine learning to enhance the data instead of only using it on a perfect data set. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, so it's essentially monitoring
how
people are interacting.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Any other thoughts?
So if you look at ERP systems and look at how much of columns of information are captured versus how much of them are actually used for decision making, this is through real world examples that I'm quoting. Looking at government databases as well as commercial databases, less than 20% of the columns actually get used. But there are data patterns, I'm only talking structured data. There are data patterns in the remaining columns which are ignored because humans don't think that is relevant. Or through my experience, I think that's less relevant. Either something about a supplier, the fact that they delivered things late, but it really didn't matter because I feel like I have a relationship with the supplier and so on. So when you look at structured data, there's a lot more patterns that you can get out of it. The other reasons why humans don't look at the other columns of data is because they just have limited time in the morning. They have to make their decisions for the day. And they can't look at like 200 columns of data to make a decision. They're going to look at 5 columns and make a decision. So that's where when you hear statements like we have a wealth of data but we don't know how to use it, it kind of all relates to it.
For the future, there's a lot of information that's coming in. So we kind of look at this planning engine as a sensor, which is delivering us data at every point, every week, every month for the next 26 months or so. But what kind of issues could come up into the future? Also in the past, we know that how often the machines broke down, how often the suppliers were late, how the delivery performance of the supplier is changing based on seasons, and so on and so forth. So all of that data, when they come in, as you said, it's impossible for human beings to try and correlate every possible cause and effect. The systems are very capable of doing that, and just going into there and finding things that we do not even think about.
Yeah, I would just to add on to that too, I think that once you figure out the changes that need to be made, it needs your tool or software or whatever you're using needs to be flexible enough to make that change as well. So, to pivot and model a different part of your business that you highlight as a real need, and so I think that that's another piece that you have to have some level of flexibility in your software tool that you're using.
Thank you, panel. Anyone else? Another question? Please. Actually, you in the back, you can raise your hand. Just a millisecond before you say your next.
Hello, my name is Zhu. I'm a supply chain student cohort of 2018. And I'm wondering, there are three elements in the process: people, process, and technology. And my question is, supply chain is unique that it's a collaboration process across different parties and using these different technologies. And there is a question about implementing these technologies across different organizations and throughout inside and outside these organizations. And I think, what's your suggestions on communicating this new technology and actually implement so that it can truly empower supply chain and these organizations?
This is a very interesting question, and it's also probably the fundamental issue why the industry is still a lack of data, because everyone is using different systems, right? Or no systems, or spreadsheets. It's a variety of different things. That's why when I was talking about technology, my interest is always in how do I capture data. And capturing data you can get through machines, but you can also to let people do the right things. And so we work a lot with our partners, and with every move from, let's say, a factory in China to a warehouse in the US, there might be 8 to 15 different parties involved, right? Customs brokers, carriers, truckers, warehouses, insurance companies, but you can actually basically get the data through different ways. But the essential thing is that you create a co-working space, and whether that co-working space is fed through API or EDI, or that people are hacking it in manually, or that you actually let them work in your software so that you directly have to get to the source. That's basically the trick. Well, there are only 10 ocean carriers in the world. I don't think I can convince them to work in my software, but I can convince them to do an integration. With truckers, it's very different, right? There are a lot of different truckers, and if you pick the right truckers, they can work actually in your software, use your ELDs, use your mobile devices, and then all of a sudden you have the raw data directly. But this is the interesting problem. If you then go to factories, it even becomes worse, because every factory has their own commercial invoice format, right? There is not a standard at all. Well, how can you solve that? Well, PO management is one of them. Right? So that you create the commercial invoice for them. But sometimes it's just very ugly, and that's data entry, just a human interface.
I'll jump in as well. When I was at Sony Pictures, our home entertainment group, supply chain operations, for me, it was about really understanding the best decisions are made where the work occurs. And if I could look at that time to my staff and really start bringing analytical tools in them for them to use, helpful. At first, it was me telling them, you're going to spend 20 minutes a day looking at the tools, trust me, right? And it moved from people looking at the tools, me kind of dragging them there, to all of a sudden now, they like using the tools. All of a sudden now, they're coming up with solutions that my executive team and I would have never dreamed of, right? So it's sort of evangelizing people and leading them along the way. And it's not about taking the data and leaving it in sort of, the data science teams that we had, or the BI teams, and they were great and did good stuff, but they weren't down focused at that specific level in the supply chain. So once we started talking to people in the supply chain, right, people who did purchasing, people who did bill of material creations, our demand planners, our people who dealt with scan-based trading, VMI, our people who dealt with the retail relationships with the big retailers out there, and got everybody start using it with one small business case, right? Hey, go figure out how to cut returns in 100 stores in this retailer. Very simple examples like that. In a matter of 6 months, I couldn't even keep up with what my staff was going after. So that was just one example of how we tried to get people involved with this and get on board. And when we did, it took a life of its own on, which was really great to see happen.
Excellent, thank you. Do you have a question? Yeah. Oh, where's the microphone? Okay. If you can yell it, go right ahead.
So I'm thinking of the telephone switchboard operator, the elevator, push button person, whatever that job is even called anymore, I forget, or even a taxi driver, right? You as a consumer, you appreciate the lean aspect of it, that you cut out the middleman, it's more efficient, it's cheaper, et cetera. In our industry, supply chain, what I'm hearing from you is wonderful and scary. Because you have a lot of youngsters who are entering class 6 of the Global Supply Chain Management Program here. And you might be saying, great degree, but you might be able to find a job because the computer took your job. So where are we going and what jobs are going to be eliminated?
Yeah, so you actually were anticipating the next discussion topic. So let's do that. So you've teed it up well. People are afraid for their jobs. Sanne, you said these companies, the shipping companies could do work with 10,000 people instead of 50,000 people.
Yeah.
So that's a gigantic impact. Other people are worried about other impacts of technology. I'm personally concerned about the rise of Skynet and the Terminators. That's my personal problem. So what do we tell people? How do we tell people how to think about this and how to deal with it as they go through their careers?
So when you look at what jobs will get eliminated, and it might not magically happen over a set period of time, it depends on industry, vertical, geography, and so on. The rule of thumb I would like to use is, if you take a step back and broadly look at what people do in supply chain organizations, I come from Silicon Valley and work with various global supply chain companies. What people do is enter data, make some decisions, and then pass it on to the next person, right? So there's really data entry, data capture, decision making, and a workflow action. If you envision any of these technologies, well, like if I'm a demand planner, if I'm a supply planner, and so on, right? These roles are at risk because you know how a simple algorithm can be written to do a lot of these things and communicate in real time. So look at these things as risky jobs. I'm not saying demand forecasting is not important. It's absolutely important. Would I have 50 demand planners waking up every day morning looking at 30 reports and coming up a decision on a particular product? Most likely not in future, because of the algorithms being sophisticated. But when I take a step back and say what humans can do even better is, the demand planning as a function was a siloed function, supply planning as a siloed function, and marketing as a siloed function. Today, very few people talk about marketing being part of supply chain. Now, in a e-tailer world, it's a highly integrated part because it's like you're looking at customer reviews and changing your course of how much you will stock. So if you take that industry example and apply to a traditional looking supply chain industry, you will know which jobs will go away, right? So I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old kid. The skill that I try to improve, not so much on how much they can program on a step-by-step rule-based system, which is how programmers are taught to think. Even in the supply chain world, I started my career at Cisco doing exactly that. It's more about what questions can I answer based on potential data that can exist, because algorithms will get written and are out there. So that's, yeah.
I would echo that I think what we saw at Programmatic was that truck drivers in particular, they had a lot more time to do more shipments and also to spend time with their families. And that the workload actually became a bit easier based on the technology. So I do think that there's definitely some benefits, but I think also as software providers, we also have the responsibility to make technology user-friendly and also not a distraction to get your work done. It needs to augment you getting your work done. So where it becomes cumbersome or distracting, I think we need to watch out for that.
We're designing the systems for people to essentially make their jobs easier. And the question is, how much easier? Because as the systems become more usable and more intelligence goes into it, obviously it's going to essentially eliminate certain processes and procedures that you do as I'll give you an example. We implemented a solution in a large high-tech company for one product division. And after the system was in use, the planners for that division, they went home at 5 o'clock in the evening at the end of the quarter. All the others had to stay until 10, 11 at night. So everybody is wondering what's going on here. But to be honest, over time, the systems, they're going to do almost everything that they're doing. So it's up to them to ensure that they're going to put themselves up to do more strategic jobs that the systems are not capable of. And the systems are, what we are lacking today, and might change in not so far future, is they don't have good bedside manners. Systems cannot explain the way the users do. And systems, they can do better surgery than doctors, but they cannot really hold their hands and tell them what the problem is and what's going to happen. So that is the human element that we definitely need today. But from what I'm hearing, I just read about a system that is going to look at your eye movement and tell you exactly what your character is like. So over time, systems are going to even look at you and know what your emotions are, how you behave, and that bedside manner is going to change. So it's up to us really to constantly change as the world changes. It's inevitable.
Yeah, and I think for the students out there, the conversation should be one of great opportunity, right? If you think about the level of business questions we're able to ask today, we're just scraping the surface, right? If you think of the efficiencies that can be generated across global supply chains, we're just scratching the surface. So when you start thinking about tools and analytics and how we can use them, we need really smart people who understand supply chain, right? The basics, the fundamentals, but you've got to know how to ask the right questions. Without the right questions, without the right strategic thinking, the AI is not going to get you there. So I'm very optimistic about it. I think it's a great period of time to be in supply chain. I think it's a great period of time to be thinking about data analytics and how to use them.
Yeah, well, there have been many productivity improvement periods in history, right? And overall, the world has become a better place because innovation drives all kinds of new jobs again. Honestly speaking, the jobs that are at risk are the jobs where we treat humans like robots, right? Data entry, right? Those are the ones that are at risk, right? We can re-educate those people, and that they do other things. Maybe they are maintaining driverless trucks. It's a little bit of a philosophical debate, right? Yes, it might have an impact on a certain group within the supply chain industry, but another group will grow, and another group outside the supply chain industry. Maybe teachers who teach supply chains. All of a sudden, we need 4 times as many. Right? So, also, it's not a reason to stop innovation.
Very good, thank you. Excellent question. Other questions from the audience? We can't all be asleep.
Hi, this is Latesha from India. I work for Bank of Baroda. A quick question. I think one of the problem in logistics across international trade is that custom clearance and bill of lading at various ports have issues, right? Now, in terms of disruptive technologies, I'm sure there'll be many solutions to it. But is there somebody working to unite all the ports across the world, all the trade organizations across the world, all the governments across the world, to ensure that electronic bill of lading is available and there's no need of physical bill of lading to kind of, so that will reduce time and it will be highly disruptive.
This is an input-output problem as well, right? If on one trade lane you need something else, and on another trade lane you have to structure other data, but you're not going to change the government, right? You're not going to say, oh, Brazil and the US are going to adopt the same practices, because they have different environments, they have to look at other different things. So you have to just structure the data that Brazil needs and connect to the system that Brazil is. But 90% of the data is the same. So it's an input-output problem, and you just have to create those interfaces that you collect the right one and spit out the other one. So I don't think you have to, I think, trying to create a global standard is probably we're not done in 200 years. So it's better to work with the standards that we have and just create the right inputs for it.
Great. Katy, did you have something? No. Next question. Okay, while we're thinking, we have a few more minutes left, so time to ask the panel other questions. While we're waiting, we talked about where we're seeing other examples where we're seeing an impact of some of these technologies, maybe something we haven't talked about already. Any thoughts?
Yeah, you mentioned beer. I think we should go out drinking.
We should talk about beer, yes.
Interesting example about the kind of benefits that people get from this technology, as I'm sure most of you are aware of. Amazon can deliver what you need before even you know you need it. And that kind of strategy helps the users to get what they want in the least amount of time or have it when they need it at the right time. The beer example that I have, we have a customer in Munich, in Bavaria, and you know how much they love their beer. The company is actually located in central Munich. There are no warehouses, and the Munich weather changes overnight, basically. So they wanted to decide how much beer they need the next day. So essentially, in order to make good forecasts, we had to look at the weather and make guesses about what the weather is going to be like, and based on that, tell them what to make and what not to make. And you don't want to be late with your beer in Bavaria. So, anyways, it turned out that with the system, we could even predict the weather because of looking at the patterns of the weather over the past. So those kinds of benefits in terms of cost reduction as well as delivery on time, it's going to be a main competitive edge for these companies, as well as obviously use to the end consumers.
So some of the biggest innovation efforts are happening in the oil and gas industry, all the way from monitoring rigs to make sure when the oil rigs are, if they are going down, not knowing when they go down, but predicting when they go down months ahead. And think about it in simple terms, right? If you are the guy on the rig, before it goes down, what are the clues that you would get? You would get sounds of some moving parts seems to be right, or the parts that are not in a certain position, or something not starting right, and so on. These are all tendencies that we have to look for to figure out if the machine is going to fail. What if we can take audio, video, and images and data to predict what's the potential breakage of this machinery or equipment 3 months or 6 months out, and kind of monitor, like you have those ECG monitors in your heart to check how a human being is performing. Same thing for machines, and predicting months or sometimes even years in advance for turbines and so on. These are things that are happening because when something like that fails, to move them, to mobilize the labor and the parts and so on takes weeks and months. And the disruption is way too expensive, or even in networking equipment, like the largest telecom providers like AT&T and so on. If a cyber attack or a networking down situation happens, mobilizing parts and people to fix that is incredibly complex. So the more you plan your supply chain ahead of time through these technologies, the more efficient it's going to get. And these are the kind of things that are being worked on right now.
Great. Any other examples? Okay, so any other questions from the audience? Please.
Really quick, sir. You're right. So I wanted to ask and provide an example on what can we do to maybe prevent technology going too far too fast? And I know someone out there probably thought bite your tongue, Courtney, type of thing. But I'll provide an example in one of my early sourcing positions. They created an auto sourcing process where, I'm going to throw countries out here, order is placed in China. The auto sourcing looks to find product that's available to automatically ship to the location to support that customer order. In this situation, there was excess processed product in Texas and Japan. It pulled the product from Texas. So instead of gaining efficiency through maybe reducing labor costs and automating this process, I was losing money through expediting product at triple the rate I could have in shipping something from Japan to China. Instead, I was shipping something from Texas to China. Does that make sense?
Yeah, somebody missed the big picture there.
Yes, that's right.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think you told a great story, and I think it's a little bit like when the map app tells you to drive into the ocean. you know, you have to have some judgment. And especially when you're programming the systems, you have to have people who actually know enough to not let it make decisions like that. And you said something about how do we not let technology move faster than we would like it. I think that's been a problem since Gutenberg's printing press came out, so I think we're going to have a hard time holding it back. We just have to have the right judgment to be able to use it properly. All right, any other questions? One more question?
Yeah, thank you, panel. We heard a lot about, you know, what enterprises should do as far as adopting disruptive technology and practices. I see a lot of students here. What can they do tomorrow onwards or tonight onwards that will help them get a job in one of these companies here?
Any thought? Are you guys hiring?
Yeah, apply.
Okay, good.
Apply for a job.
Yeah, I would say that for us at Lanetix, we're looking for people who understand how to listen to people and understand business process, because that's a lot of what we do, is going to large companies, understanding their business process, and then figure out how to model that and how to put it into software, and then also work on change management. So, you know, a lot of the companies that we work with are large organizations, global organizations, have been used to doing something in a certain way for a long time, and so knowing the right way to influence change internally, and also with your, as a consultant, I think that that's an important skill set. So that's the kind of person that we look for.
Great. Any other thoughts?
Number one recommendation is go to USC Business School.
All right, so you got head start.
Number two, you know, when we hire people, they essentially have all the skills that we need them to have. They have the right degree, they have the right experience, and so on and so forth. What we are really, really looking for when they walk in is how they work with other people, and how they behave, and how much passion they have, how much interesting they are. You know, all of those are the elements that I think would make them very successful no matter what job they do. Just knowing this, you know, people who get fired, they don't get fired because they don't know their job. They were hired because they knew their job very well. But they get fired because they cannot talk, they cannot work and collaborate with others. And I think that's a very important skill that I'm sure in business schools it's also made emphasized. So that's really what my recommendation is.
And I would say the examples where you've gone out into the field and you've experimented, even failed, trying something new in a company, whether it's an internship or after hours during your semester, and bringing back that story about what you learned and what you want to do is very helpful, right? That and a really good sense of key performance indicators, and you're in.
Great. One more comment?
So we are under constant pressure from Google to groom supply chain experts with machine learning know-how. Right? I've had conversation with Nick and others at USC as well. It's a tricky combination of skill. You really need to know supply chain domain. You need to know machine learning. And you need to know how to apply, because these are the people who truly disrupt the industry and innovate.
Great. Thank you all very much. I'd like to ask you to thank our panelists. Fantastic job.
Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Dave, for your moderation. Very well done. As they get their picture taken and all that, I want everybody to know that we will be exiting this room in its entirety, because they're going to change the whole room around. So you need to take your stuff with you when you go. We're going to be heading now into the breakout sessions. We're going to have the Optimizing Human Capital Through Continuous Improvement panel will be held in the Franklin on the 3rd floor. The Risk Management panel will be held in the Forum on the 4th floor. And the Supply Chain Profession Education panel will be in the Rosen room on the 2nd floor. And then you're going to be back here at 4:05 for some closing remarks, and then we head into the INC cocktail mixer. For those of you not familiar with LA on a Friday afternoon, you do not want to be on the freeway. You want a cocktail. Then when it clears up, you get on the road. So again, optimizing human capital through continuous improvement is on the 3rd floor, Franklin. Risk management panel, 4th floor, and supply chain professional education panel, Rosen Room on the 2nd floor. Back here at 4:05. And those breakout sessions start shortly, 2:35. And again, everybody needs to get out of the room. Take your stuff with you.